Hi everyone, and welcome to this talk on social epistemology. My name is Jesper Kallestrup. I am a newly appointed professor in the philosophy department at Aberdeen University. So today I'll say a little bit about what this notion of social epistemology is. If you just start with this first slide. Yes. So what is social epistemology? So epistemology is about knowledge, basically, and traditionally researchers in this area have been interested in knowledge of individuals. So consider an individual in isolation from other individuals, or how they are sort of embedded in their society at large. But in the last decade or 2 decades or so, increasingly epistemologists have switched attention and focus to consider knowledge, understanding, justified belief, and similar notions in a social context. So how is knowledge produced when individuals are members of societies and in the ways in which they interact with other individuals? So it's a growing and exciting area of research within epistemology, has attracted a lot of attention, and people coming to this from a variety of different backgrounds, trying to contribute to this debate. What I'll do in this very brief talk is just to give you a quick overview of 3 important topics within social epistemology. So I'll say something first about epistemic virtues, and then I'll move on to look at the role of trust in testimony. And then finally, I'll say a little bit about whether groups can have knowledge over and above knowledge had by their members. Next slide, please. Yes, okay, so epistemic virtues. So there is an area also within epistemology called virtue epistemology, whereby one is trying to look into the role of virtues in a theory of what knowledge is. And there are roughly sort of 2 camps within virtue epistemology. So there are those philosophers who think of virtues as reliable cognitive faculties. So those are things like perception, introspection, when you look inward to see what kind of mental state you're in. There's memory and reasoning and so on. So those are the ones that we call reliable cognitive faculties. And then there are some other epistemologists who are more interested in refined or cultured character traits. So these are things like conscientiousness, open-mindedness, courage, caution, diligence, humility, and so on. What I'll do in a minute is to illustrate how philosophers have theorized about courage, caution, and humility in particular. But first, we need to draw an important distinction, because some of these virtues are self-regarding in the sense that they really just pertain to one's own knowledge or intellectual flourishing more generally. However, some of these virtues are directed at other individuals in their society at large, and so we can call those virtues other regarding or other directed virtues. And it's important to get this dimension on board, because that's where the social epistemological considerations are important to us, to see how these virtues can promote and further the knowledge of other individuals. So next slide, please. Okay, so let's look a little bit deeper into the notion of courage and caution here, and we call them intellectual virtues because, of course, we're interested in knowledge, understanding, wisdom, and other kinds of epistemic states. So very generally, we can say that intellectual courage and caution are virtues that dispose us to respond appropriately to perceived pressure or threats in our intellectual lives. So think, for example, of a scientist whose research into lifestyle diseases is funded by the food and drink industry. For such a scientist would need a good portion of courage, but also some caution. In that, of course, there may be areas of research where where one need to be a little bit careful in how one approaches the research. in that, of course, one could risk one's funding if it's too controversial, or the funding provider might just pull out of it, on the one hand. On the other hand, you need to be courageous or brave enough to take on this research, which potentially could show, that excessive consumptions of alcohol or what have you can have certain detrimental health effects, and of course they may not be welcome news to the funder. And so as a researcher here, you need to tread very carefully, and that's why I think you need to balance courage and caution, and to sort of find a path between that. So we can say that courage can dispose such a researcher not to be unduly intimidated, and put on the one hand. On the other hand, caution also disposes a researcher, in this case, not to take inappropriate risks in achieving knowledge. So the virtuous thing here is to be not too rash and not too fearful, and that is a kind of virtue that we would also regard as being directed at oneself, in that it is, for this example in mind, pertain to the knowledge that the scientist has in isolation, as it were. But of course, we also talk about whistleblowers, for instance, and so there is also the courage to publicly announce one's knowledge in the face of social or institutional pressure. So it may well be that this researcher comes across some information that is in the public domain, in the interest of the public, and so would want to make that information available to a general public. And of course, it may well be that one's funder here would seek to prevent or put pressure on one not to do that. Or with the other example I give here on the slide, you can imagine a police constable who, in the public interest, again would, as it were, blow the whistle about some miscarriages of justice by her superior officers. We've seen cases like that in the media. So that would require a good portion of courage for one to announce that in the public, the information that one has come across. So there is clearly also an other regarding dimension to these particular intellectual virtues of courage and caution. Next slide, please. Great. Okay, so let's move on to the last virtue I'll talk about today. Just the one before, namely that of intellectual humility. So this is an important notion, I think, and is one which I've done some research on myself. What is it to be an intellectually humble agent? Well, it certainly concerns, in very general terms, the proper acknowledgement of the character of one's cognitive abilities. So if you look up a dictionary definition of humility, it's typically characterized rather negatively in terms of one not having a lowly opinion of oneself, or one lowering oneself in regards to others, or of not thinking that you're better than other people. So that's a fairly negative conception of what intellectual humility is, and it is a conception that squares quite badly with humility if we are to conceive of that as a virtue. So let's see if we can articulate a better definition or characterization of humility. So I think indeed the negative one isn't suitable, because indeed if you have very good and strong intellectual abilities, why would you want to debase or degrade them in comparison with others? I don't think that would be the virtuous thing to do. Because that would actually prevent or frustrate your epistemic pursuit. You're trying to achieve knowledge of whatever your epistemic aims or goals are, if you had such a lowly opinion of yourself. So let's see if we can, as I said, try to work towards a better understanding of what intellectual humility is than the one that the dictionaries give us. So next slide, please. So the way we should approach this topic, I think, is to realize that what we need is not just this negative conception of oneself as having a lowly opinion of one's abilities and skills, but rather that it involves a correct assessment of one's achievements and abilities, and thereby also a recognition of one's inherent limitations, that indeed one can only do so much with the abilities that one has, and there may well be various limitations and also, I suppose, types of shortcomings in one's cognitive repertoire. So what I think we need to do is to, on the one hand, avoid to overestimate one's strength and underestimate one's weaknesses, because that would display a kind of excess, the vice of excess, if one were to do that. So that is what one needs to avoid if one is to display humility. On the other hand, one should, at the other end of the spectrum, one should also avoid underestimating one's strength and overestimating one's weaknesses, because that would be to display the vice of deficiency. And so that's what we also need to avoid. So we need to get a correct assessment of the strengths and weaknesses of one's cognitive skills and abilities. So that's why I call this a correct assessment of one's achievement and abilities. And I think that's part of what humility is. But I also think that humility needs to include an openness to other people's points of view and an inclination to change one's mind if required by the evidence. And of course, it needs to exclude this kind of excessive intellectual self-regard that we see in people who display conceit or intellectual arrogance. So there is also, I think, another regarding dimension to humility. It isn't just about correctly assessing one's own strengths and weaknesses, but it is also to manifest the virtue, the intellectually humble person, qua virtuous, also manifest an open-mindedness and a tolerance, as a notion of being unbiased towards other views and points of views and so on, to be conciliatory and to be willing to revise and perhaps abandon one's own belief if one learns that other people have relevant evidence that can be on one's own points of view. So I think that you will need to include that as well. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's move on. So that was a little bit about the virtues. I think what we'll do secondly now is look at the role of trust in testimony. And because indeed trust is also a kind of virtue, I think that's fair enough to say, and the role it can play in testimony, whereby we understand testimony not just as the sort of thing you do in court when you as a witness give testimony, but very generally understood to include any kind of transmission of information from a speaker to a hearer or a sender to a receiver. So indeed, if you look at everything we know about the world, probably most of what we know would stem from the word of others. So of course we've acquired quite a lot of knowledge ourselves by means of, perception, reasoning, and so on. But I think it's probably right to say that most of what the knowledge that we have is something that we owe to others. Of course, now we may well have forgotten when, where, and who told us all these sorts of things from, we learn from school, from primary school, secondary education, university life, our friends and family, through the media, TV, the internet, and so on and so forth. But indeed, we still have all of that knowledge, and we owe that to others. So I think there is here, when we're looking at testimony, a social process of cooperation between different people at different locations, and that can be traced quite far back in time. But indeed, it all requires a kind of trust that is different from when you merely rely on, say, your smartphone, or when you are eavesdropping on others who are communicating. So what is exactly that difference between merely relying on someone and then actually trusting them to tell us the truth? Well, one view here is, and this is a view that I quite fancy myself, is called the assurance view of testimony. So when someone is offering testimony, if you ask me for directions to the Union Street in Aberdeen and I tell you how to get there, I am in a way providing an offer, a guarantee of truth. I assure you that what I tell you is the truth. And so in a way, I give you my word that you can take my word for it. And I do so out of consideration for your need to know the truth. So you need to get to the bank before they close, or to do some shopping or what have you. So I'm aware that you have a need for me to tell the truth. And so that's why I tell you the truth. And so therefore, you can trust me to tell you the truth. And I give you a sort of guarantee or an assurance that what I'm telling you is correct. And so what happens is that if I deliberately speak falsely, if I mislead you or lead you astray, so you walk in the wrong direction and will miss the bank before they close, then you are entitled to blame me for having led you astray. And indeed, certain feelings of betrayal or resentment are in order. And not so if, I'm in the way in which I rely on my phone to wake me up in the morning. If it fails to do that, I might get annoyed or frustrated, but there's not really a sense in which I can blame the phone, or that the phone has betrayed my trust. That doesn't really make sense in that case. So it's this special kind of personal relationship between people where there's trust involved, and the role that plays in facilitating the transmission of information from a speaker to a hearer. So next slide, please. Okay, so when we are looking at a testimony, when you have a speaker and a hearer, or a sender and a receiver, as on if you're thinking more generally about, say, news corporations, the BBC broadcasting the news. So there is a sender and there are recipients, consumer of news out there. In those sort of cases, we as a hearer or a listener, we directly rely on others for knowledge. Okay, so there's a direct relationship of dependence here between the speaker and the hearer, or the sender and the receiver. But there are also, as a philosopher called Sandy Goldberg pointed out, more indirect or diffuse ways in which we rely on others for knowledge and information. So here's an example of that. So suppose you've been watching the BBC News non-stop for several hours. Sort of rolling news. They keep just, you've probably done this. And so suppose someone asks you, do you know whether Boris Johnson has recently resigned as Prime Minister? Sorry, do you know that Boris Johnson hasn't recently resigned as Prime Minister? And suppose someone asks you that, and then I think you're entitled to say yes. I do know that he hasn't recently resigned as Prime Minister, because if that were true, you would have heard about it by now. So what's going on here? That seems like a perfectly legitimate answer to give to the question of whether Boris Johnson hasn't recently resigned as a Prime Minister, perhaps because he hasn't managed to secure a trade deal with the EU so far, or what have you. What's going on here? It seems like a perfectly fine answer to give to that question. Well, you're drawing an inference, and what you're doing is that you are acquiring knowledge of an absence or a lack of knowledge, or a negation, namely that Boris Johnson hasn't recently resigned as Prime Minister. But you draw that inference from an absence of knowledge, because you don't know that Boris Johnson has recently resigned as Prime Minister. So that's quite interesting. So you actually have a case where, by inference, you infer some knowledge of an absence from an absence of knowledge. That's a very interesting phenomenon. But in this case, what I want to get to is that you are relying on the BBC, not directly telling you something, but not telling you something, right? And if Boris Johnson had recently resigned, they would have told you. And so what you're doing is you're saying, well, they didn't tell me. They wasn't on the news, and I've been watching it for several hours. It wasn't on the news. So I can infer that, he's still the Prime Minister. He has not resigned. And so there is a kind of epistemic coverage that news corporations, news outlet provide in a certain domain. Here is the domain of domestic politics. And what they do is that, because they have journalists all over the world, and they reliably tracks the relevant evidence. So they always got people informed about what's going on in Downing Street and in Westminster and so on and so forth. And then they make that available to a target audience. So they know that the people who are watching the BBC News, what kind of interest they have. And so they would have reported that if that had been true, and they would have reported it at the right time when they were deeming that bit of news as worthy to be broadcasted to its audience. So there is a kind of reliance here. You're not directly relying on someone telling you something, but you're relying on them to tell you what's sort of going on in a certain domain of inquiry or of news here, in this case, domestic politics. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so far we've been talking about testimony when it goes well, when we acquire knowledge of how to find directions to Union Street by asking some pedestrian about that, or we get news as broadcasted by the BBC or what have you. But of course, sometimes testimony goes badly wrong, and we can receive false bits of testimony, misleading testimony, or perhaps testimony that is incomplete. There could be someone indeed with a political agenda who might try to make us think that a pressing problem is exaggerated or even non-existent, or they may try to cook up an imaginary threat or a conspiracy theory to divert attention. So if you've been watching the news recently from America, you will have seen examples of people communicating with such agendas. And of course, such deceit is very troubling. It is true that we have some checks and balances in place, which can be used to some extent to weed out falsehoods, to critically evaluate others say so. We may be able to do a little bit on that score ourselves, but we're not all experts in the relevant fields of climate change or public health or what have you. So there's only so much you can do as an ordinary, citizen or consumer. But what we can do is, of course, as a society collectively, we can put a claim under greater scrutiny. We can fact check that. We might ask the government authorities to, employ fact checkers, or we can ask platforms such as Facebook or Twitter to be more proactive, flagging up information that is widely regarded as being perhaps false or misleading or incomplete. Or they could issue disclaimers of various kinds by doing just that. So there are some things we can do collectively to combat the kind of deceit that we find particular in social media, but also more generally on the internet here. So that's certainly some of the topics that are currently debated by social epistemologists. Going back to the more general problem about testimonial beliefs, it's also the case that because the vast amount of our knowledge is owed to others, it is through testimony, that is very difficult for us to justify all of our testimony without having to do that in terms of other testimonial knowledge or information that we can acquire. And so that raises the question, the philosophical question of how we can justify all of our testimonial knowledge as such. And it seems that unless we have some sort of general right or entitlement to trust the word of others, then our testimonial beliefs are on a rather insecure footing here. Next slide, please. Okay, so just going back to Aberdeen here, we have a very famous philosopher, Thomas Reid, and his view on this was exactly that testimony constitutes an autonomous epistemic source, that when we make assertions or when we tell other people that thus and so, then those tellings or assertions are trustworthy unless shown otherwise. So here's a quotation from one of his work. Since God intended us to be social creatures, he implanted in us, as he said, a propensity to speak the truth. And we can call this the principle of veracity, as well as a disposition to confide in the veracity of others and to believe what they tell us. And we call this the principle of credulity. So that seems very plausible, that indeed there are we have such propensities or dispositions. And perhaps they can justify the claim that these assertions are trustworthy unless they're shown otherwise, because we are just inclined or disposed to speak truly and to believe what other people tell us. So that seems like a nice view that squares well with a lot of commonsensical cases, as when I ask for directions and you tell me how to find Union Street and so on. But going back to social media, because of the amount of incorrect, misleading or incomplete information that's out there, maybe it's a bit naive to think that we can just rely on these principles. So there is also growing interest in what is often called filter bubbles or echo chambers. So epistemic structures that are designed explicitly or explicitly to undermine information and to prevent us being exposed to alternative points of view and so on. And so it looks like in those kind of cases, We can't just uncritically form testimonial beliefs from these random sources, because that would just be irresponsible of us as epistemic agents. We need to, we have a duty to monitor these sources for signs of untrustworthiness. And if we fail to do that, then, as Elizabeth Frigga pointed out, we are gullible, and we are not acting in a responsible way as epistemic agents. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'll now move on to the last topic of this talk. So it concerns groups and the relationship between groups and their members. And so, as I said at the beginning of this talk, traditionally epistemologists have been interested in knowledge as it pertains to an individual agent like me or you. But increasingly, they're also getting interested in groups and whether groups can have knowledge, or whether they can act as a sort of an epistemic agent in their own right. And so let's look a little bit into this here the last few minutes. So of course we certainly speak we should start with trust, begin with trust here, which we just talked about earlier. We certainly speak as if groups are also able to trust individuals, individuals are able to trust groups, and groups can trust other groups. So we say things like students trust their universities. A university here is a group, so I understand a group in a very sort of broad sense as a kind of umbrella term that includes institutions, organizations, governments, churches, armies, and so on. So very sort of inclusive notion of a group here. But we do speak that way, indeed. And so, of course, students will experience the kind of betrayal I mentioned earlier, but at the group level, institutional betrayal, if the management fails to prevent discrimination, for example. We also say that banks trust their employees and so are subject to individual betrayal by an employee. When, you know, this sort of rogue trader, whatever it is, abuses that trust for personal gain. We've seen some examples of that in the media as well. Likewise, we have relationships of trust between two distinct groups. So here's another example. Health services trust public service broadcasters to report impartially, and so undergoes a kind of group betrayal if they parrot government spin as uncontested fact. So the question before us now is whether such language, should we understand that literally? Does that really mean that groups can trust? Can they feel betrayal? Can they feel resentment towards other groups? And the key question is here whether they are indeed minds of their own. So next slide, please. So let's home in on the problem about group knowledge here. Again, we speak as if groups are able to have knowledge in pretty much the same way that individuals are. And so one argument in support of the claim that groups can have knowledge is just that that's the way we speak. We speak there so uncontroversially in lots of different contexts and in diverse ways. And that certainly suggests that we should take such content at face value. So I've got a couple of quotes here on the slide to illustrate such language. So here's a quotation from the Telegraph. The government knew diesel cars were emitting deadly pollutants at levels 4 times greater than the official safety limits, and yet ministers continue to offer tax incentives promoting diesel cars. So here's some knowledge that we attribute to a government, and then we also think it's reasonable to ask that the government act on the knowledge that they have. And likewise, here's another example. There's a football club, Sunderland AFC, new player kissed schoolgirl. So there's a knowledge that a football club can have. Next slide, please. Okay, so what I want to do here the last few minutes is just give you an example of how a group can have knowledge that is over and above any knowledge had by its individual members. So of course, the first question we settled was whether groups are able to have knowledge. I think we should answer that affirmatively. Yes, they can have knowledge. The second question is whether that knowledge reduces to knowledge of the members or whether it is over and above knowledge had by its members. So I want to present to you now a little toy example. And again, it has to do with the way research teams operate. And this is due to a philosopher called Alexander Bird, who exploits what in cognitive science is called distributed cognition. So it involves the idea that we have an amount of cognitive labor that needs to be done, but it can be divided within a group. so that some cognitive tasks are producing this group knowledge is divided into subtasks, which are then assigned to individuals that have the kind of relevant expertise. So I call this example the research team. It is indeed modeled on one of Bird's own examples. So imagine you have Dr. X here, who's a physicist, and we have Dr. Y, who's a mathematician, and they collaborate on a project to demonstrate the truth of the conjecture that Q. Their project can be broken down into 3 parts. So there's part 1, that's the problem in physics, the problem of showing that P. And that will be the work of Dr. X alone, because Dr. X is the physicist and she will carry out the relevant experimental work and so on. Next slide. Yeah, and then we have part 2. So that's a problem in pure mathematics. So it's just proving the conditional that if P then Q, and that's a job for which Dr. Y takes responsibility because she's a mathematician. The final part 3 of this task is the application of modus ponens to the result of part 1 and 2. So we have P and we have if P then Q, and so all you have to do is just conclude that Q. And so what they do now is that they arrange for an assistant to publish the paper, just in case he receives from Dr. X the demonstration that P is true, and from Dr. Y the proof of the conditional if P then Q. And so what happens after then is that they don't really communicate. So they may well be based in different parts of the world, which often happens in real life indeed. And so they don't communicate, they just carry out their respective task without exchanging any information about how they're getting on. Nor do they communicate with the assistant. And so they don't actually know at the time they publish whether they have established the conclusion that Q. Next and last slide, please. Okay, so now we have this mini research team of Dr. X and Y, and it looks like they come to know Q. That seems like a reasonable interpretation of this case. But when you reflect on this, you see that neither of them actually knows that proposition, because one of them knows Q, the other one knows if P then Q, but they don't really know that Q because they've carried out these subtasks in isolation and they haven't communicated. And we can also assume that the assistant doesn't know this because he may not even understand the right kind of physics or math that is involved in the demonstration that P, or the proof that if P then Q. All he has to do is just go into the journal website, press save, and then upload the paper, and then press submit, so that the paper got sent off. So if you think this example, I don't know what you think about this, but as one interpretation certainly, and seems fairly plausible to me, is that our team, the collective together, has some knowledge that diverts from any knowledge of its individual members. And so if that's right, then it seems like we have to acknowledge that some groups can have knowledge, not just over and above the individuals, but can also act on that knowledge, and therefore, in a certain sense, be an epistemic agent, a mind of its own. And I think that's a very interesting notion that we need to ascribe mentality to groups, and that they can act as agents in their own right. So that's also a live, very interesting area of research within social epistemology. People are coming to this also with expertise in cognitive science and other branches of the human and social sciences. So thanks very much. That was sorry, I was a little bit over time, but that was my mini lecture. Now I think we'll take some questions. Let me see. Okay, so there's someone asking up here. The first question is, does epistemic dependence go back to primitive times? People in the past wouldn't have had media sources, but maybe relied on memories, written transcripts, etc. for knowledge. Yes, very good question here. So I think there were 2 types of epistemic dependence that I mentioned, and so here I'm relying on Sandy Goldberg's research in this area. So in the case of testimony, or sort of a radio and TV of course, which we didn't have in primitive times, you are directly relying on someone for knowledge or information. And then there was a kind of more subtle, diffuse or indirect kind of reliance that I illustrated with the example of coverage provided by the BBC. And there are other cases where you indirectly rely on others, such as the other example I gave with governments or platforms trying to screen out or monitor misinformation that's out there. So you're not directly relying on them, but you're relying on them to only be exposed to reliable, trustworthy types of information. So if you go back to before the the internet and so on, I think it's still certainly the case that we have direct reliance. You would always have humans exchanging information and knowledge and so on. So that has always been the case. I think there's also been types of indirect reliance. Of course, if you're a parent, as I am, then you're also aware of who your children should listen to and get their knowledge, their information from, and so on. So as a kind of authority, someone in the know, you also have an obligation or a duty to ensure that others, especially the ones for whom you're responsible, are able to access sources that are reliable and trustworthy. So I think the answer to that is probably yes. Someone else is asking here, why is intellectual humility important if it's negatively is important if it's negatively perceived? Right. So I tried to argue here that on the negative conception, the one that we find in dictionaries, it's hard to square that conception with humility as a virtue, because you're being asked to sort of lower yourself, undervalue your own abilities, your own achievements, and so on. And that doesn't seem to be a virtuous what the virtuous person would do, right? If indeed she is brilliant in some ways, why should she being asked to deliberately downplay or lower her achievements and abilities in regard to others? Clearly, those abilities and skills others can benefit from them. So she needs to make use of them in order to benefit her own knowledge, but also help others acquire knowledge and understanding. So I think if humility is a kind of virtue, something that we need to instill and nurture in others, for instance, as an educator, a teacher, which is something I think is important in education, that the role of humility in the classroom, for instance, is that we are open-minded, that we listen to others, that we're willing to consider other points of view and revise our own beliefs. I think these are all action that are typical of a virtuous person. And I think that is that would be prevented by this sort of negative conception, because people are always being asked to lower or disvalue their own abilities and achievements. I hope that answered that question. So Tom is asking, how can you develop your intellectual courage to be able to effectively communicate an issue? That's a good question, Tom. Again, as a teacher, as a university teacher, there's something that we think a lot about, how we can instill that courage in our students, effective communicators, and can communicate clearly, succinctly to an audience, and not just within academia, but also more generally. Something that we're certainly working on within the university. I don't have so much expertise in this particular area, Tom. I think you'll need to maybe speak with people who are more in sort of know the pedagogical side of things here. But I think it is important to reflect on the role of intellectual courage, as well as caution and humility in the way that we communicate with others, both within academia and also to a broader public. Then there's Kate is asking, great presentation, really helpful to have examples to relate the theory. Thanks, Kate. Kevin is saying, with regard to group knowledge, does the group need to work together? Say one academic physicist proves that P and another academic mathematician proves that P, if P then Q, yet they don't know anything about each other. Would one be able to say that academics as a group know that Q because of the contribution? Yeah, Kevin, that's what I was trying to illustrate with that example, if you are persuaded by it. So do they need to work together? So that depends on what you mean by working together. So of course it's been set up so that we have this distribution of cognitive labor. that, the physicist, she's responsible for the experimental work. The mathematician will do the conditional, that if P then Q, because that's like an abstract proof you need here. And so that's sort of been pre-designed. And so they just, conduct their research independently. And then they send that information back to the assistant, who will then just put it together. So you can imagine the paper being pre-written, and all the assistant has to do is trying to collate that information and then send that paper off to a journal. So that's the sense in which they need to work together. I do think, Kevin, in a more sort of realistic cases where there is a lot of collaboration between various researchers, obviously, and so I think there's just a diversity of different types of collaboration or work between individual members of a group here. Kevin is also saying, you mentioned that knowledge of absence in the Boris Johnson case is acquired via inference from absence of knowledge. Yes. Is it possible to look at this from another angle, where knowledge of absence is acquired via inference from knowledge? Yeah. My thought is that the conditional, if Boris Johnson is no longer Prime Minister, I would have heard of this on the BBC. Yes, may count as knowledge, provided that the subject is receptive and enough time has passed for the BBC to relay relative information. Yes. This proposition, coupled with the belief that I haven't heard about Boris Johnson no longer being PM on the BBC, which also seems known, leads to the inference that Boris Johnson is still Prime Minister. This appears to me as an instance of inferential knowledge from knowledge. Is this just another way of looking at the same phenomenon that you described? Yeah, I think it is, Kevin, as I understand it here. So it's a bit dense. I'll need to unpack that. But as that was the intention behind this example, that you watch. Here's a reliable source of news, and also they have provide this coverage. So they will BBC will broadcast news items that they regard as newsworthy, and they would do so at the right sort of time. So if you watch it long enough, you would come to know that Boris Johnson had resigned, if he had. Okay, that's the kind of thing in advance that they would definitely bring that on air, right? Because that's highly newsworthy if you are living in the UK and are interested in domestic politics. So given that they haven't broadcasted that, you can safely infer and thus come to know that Boris Johnson hasn't resigned, because they didn't report that he did resign. And so you come to get some knowledge of an absence, as I said, or a negation that he has resigned, and so that he's still the Prime Minister. So as I read this, Kevin, I might need to talk to you about this a bit further. I think you and I agree on what the case is aimed to show, and so this is so indeed it would be me looking at the same phenomenon that you're trying to capture here as I read it, Kevin. Okay, there anything else here in the chat? These were really good questions. Thanks very much, everyone. And as I said at the beginning, there are many topics here. I can't do justice to all of them. I just picked on 3 and touched on them very quickly, and I realized there was a lot of information in there. But you just got a quick overview. Some of the really hotly debated topics within social epistemology, and people it's also an exciting area of research because it's interdisciplinary, and people coming to it with different backgrounds, from cognitive science, psychologists, people working in computer science, trying to model some of these phenomena, whether you have multiple epistemic agents. There are people doing, for instance, research on filter bubbles. So we know that search engines will rank a particular search on the basis of your past search history. So does that raises that concern that you're not being presented with alternative points of view, because you'll just be reaffirmed in the beliefs you already have, and so it may even lead to this what I call a kind of echo chamber, where you just kind of reaffirming beliefs you already have, and may even thus go on to disregard other items of news or information, and that's of course potentially problematic if the information you are getting isn't sufficiently reliable.
So there was a lot of some you can model this formally, and there are people doing research on that. There are also people coming from political, social sciences, interested in the way, with elections and voter confidence and trust in, the fair elections and in government and so on. The role of trust has been eroded in some societies, and what does that mean for the way in which we have access to knowledge and information that we need as a citizen of a society. So it's an exciting and lively area of research, and as I said, I can't do justice to all of the many topics that there are, but this was just a wee taste of. Anything else here? Let me see. Kevin Oliver, thank you. My apologies for a long question. No worries, Kevin. Feel free to get in touch with me afterwards if you want to discuss further via email. Max says, just wanted to say thank you for the interesting presentation. I really enjoyed it. Thanks, Max. I should perhaps say in the last few minutes that we are also in the philosophy department at Aberdeen launching an exciting new taught postgraduate program, a master's program, whereby you can apply from with different backgrounds. You need not have been a philosopher. You can also apply to the program with a background in other parts of the humanities, the social sciences, or even with a science background. But you have an interest in philosophy and in taking philosophy into society and for philosophy to make a difference in the real world. And so what we do on this program is to work with students who want to do an impact case or to set up some knowledge exchange activities with a business or a company, with local government, with an NGO, with other parts of academia, to really demonstrate the fantastic potential there is for philosophers and philosophy to make a real difference to real world problems, societal challenges, whether that be the kind of things I talked about in this lecture to do with information in a society on the internet, what have you, or whether it relates to climate change or health or education or IT, and so on and so forth. So we are quite open to diverse backgrounds, people applying to this program. We'll launch this as we speak with a start date of September. And so just get in touch with myself, or you can look at the website. But perhaps we can post a link to this, Jacinta, for people to see how they can get in touch with us if they're interested in this program. And I'm happy to send information, pass information on, or talk to you about that. But yes, anything else? Okay. Great. Well, thanks very much. It was nice to kind of meet you all out there in virtual world, and hope you enjoyed this, and perhaps I'll speak with you on some other occasion. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.